Mirdita dhe mirëserë në Fakultetin e drejtësisë në Universitetit Tiranës. Kam kënaqësinë që sot kemi një ditë të dytë aktivitetesh të rëndësishme pas së djeshmes, një konferencë ndërkombëtare me Universitetin Washington and Lee në fushën e klinikës ligjit. Sot kemi rast të shkëlqyer, kemi një ekspert të shquar në fushën e drejtës, profesorin David Mikloroj nga Universiteti i Londrës, i cili do të ndajë me ju një temë shumë interesante, le të themi iniciativës forumit Veritas për të sjellë mjediset e fakultetit. Profesorin e shquar do të ndajë me ju një temë shumë interesante që ka të bëjë me terrorizmin, nëse të drejtat e njeriut, të cilat ky faktor kriminal prek drejt për drejt janë shkak apo janë një element tjetër i terrorizmit. Domethënë, leksioni është mjaft intrigues, është mjaft filozofik në mënyrën se si është konceptuar, dhe unë besoj që do të gjej vëmendjen tuaj të drejt për drejt. Më lejoni që të falenderoj dhe forumin Veritas që na bëri të mundur, ardhin e profesorit në auditoret tona. Mendoj që pasurojmë vlerat e kurrikulës tonë dhe të biografisë tonë universitare akademike duke patur profesor të niveleve të shquara të universitetet të tjera perëndimore.
Good morning and welcome everybody. I'm Chilita Sarachi and I study law in this faculty, third year. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Veritas Forum for coming here in our faculty for the first time. And now for more, allow me to invite a very well-known journalist, Mr. Benny Saleh. I hope we'll have a great time together.
So we're going to do this in English. This was what I was told. I bet everybody understands just fine, right? Okay, show of hands. All right, good. Okay, I knew that. So, Veritas Forum. It was created in Boston, in Harvard University, 1986. It's when the first forum happened. It's a forum that is organized by students and students' organizations on questions of life, philosophy, faith, things that intrigue us, things that make us think. By the year 2010, Veritas Forum has been held in the Netherlands, England, France, lately in Macedonia, and since 2013, it's been also happening in Albania. So it takes place in campuses like this with students who want to dwell on these questions and get to the bottom of things and think about stuff that interests them and make those big questions in life. And it's always with very distinguished professors and thinkers and philosophers that we ask these questions about truth. What is the truth about different topics? That's why the name is Veritas, you know, the Latin word. Also because it started at Harvard, where the word Veritas is engraved in the walls of that university. Today, I have a special honor to welcome here to Albania. He's also been here another 6 times before, helping Albania with banking laws and integration. But Mr. David McElroy is a barrister from London, and he's also a lecturer at the University of London. Today we'll talk about human rights. Human rights, as you know, is something that we talk about very often. Freedom of speech, freedom of choice, freedom to offend people. And as you know, in France, not too long ago, there was a shooting at the Charlie Hebdo newspaper. And then there was a debate. You know, is there freedom of speech where you offend other people? Is there a right to say whatever you think, even though that, you know, might make some people uncomfortable or might irritate some people? So where does one start and where does the other end? You know that even here in Albania we had a debate in media studios, and I'm sure in faculties also, about this freedom of, you know, speech and human rights, and how that clashes sometimes with freedom of religion or right of religion. So today we're going to explore those topics, and I don't want to make it much more longer on my part, but I want to invite here Mr. David McElroy. Thank you.
I'm going to do this in English as well. Despite the fact I've been to Albania 7 times now, I only know 4 words of Albanian. They are shumir, which I find I can use to say just about anything I need to, falimenderit, and lavash. Which for 1 or 2 people who don't know Albanian is, as I understand it, the Albanian for car wash. Because last time I came there seemed to be so many car washes on the way into the city from the airport. On the 30th of September 2005, the Danish newspaper, the Jutland Post, published 12 editorial cartoons, most of which depicted the Prophet Muhammad. The reaction in 2006 led to more than 200 reported deaths, attacks on Danish and other European embassies, attacks on churches and Christians, and a major international boycott. Danish Prime Minister Anders Rasmussen described the controversy as Denmark's worst international relations incident since the Second World War. That was in 2006. Of course, in 2015, we saw major shootings in Paris at the offices of Charlie Hebdo and then a supermarket that was run for the Jewish community. I was booked after the Charlie Hebdo shootings to go to Denmark. I arrived in Denmark a week after the shootings in the synagogue there and again at a meeting of journalists. And my hotel was on the road where the synagogue was, where the shootings had happened. And this is a picture of some of the flowers that were outside the synagogue, together with a message written in English and Danish and Hindi and Arabic. And the message that was written in all those different languages was, "We just want to live together." So the question we're looking at this morning is, are human rights a cause of terrorism? Or are they in fact intended to be a cure for terrorism? And in answering that question, I think we have to realize there are 2 dangerous stories that are told at the moment. One dangerous story is that human rights are what we believe in when we've given up believing in religion. The other dangerous story is that human rights are therefore somehow anti-religious. And that produces a reaction, because you then get fundamentalist religious believers who think that because human rights are anti-religion, if you're serious about your religion, you must be anti-human rights. And what I want to do this morning is to demonstrate how those stories are false, and to do so by looking at the history of human rights. I suspect lawyers have short memories. Certainly, when I was studying human rights, the theory of human rights began in 1948 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, promulgated by the UN, was a response to horror. It was a response to the horror of the death camps at places like Auschwitz and elsewhere, where Nazi Germany had built camps in order to exterminate those they regarded as subhuman. First targets were the Jews and the Gypsies and people who were homosexual. The plan, once they'd wiped all of them out, was to turn to exterminating 60 million Slavs. That was what the Nazis would have done next had they won the Second World War. And when the death camps were discovered and the concentration camps were liberated, the victorious powers had to ask, how can we stop this ever happening again? And so they felt they needed to establish a code of minimum standards, agreements that all governments would abide by to treat everyone with dignity and with respect, to treat no one as subhuman. And so documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights set out an account of what is due to human beings. And so Article 1 of that Declaration of Human Rights solemnly proclaims all humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And having talked about that in Lecture 1 of our course on human rights, we then move on as lawyers and we start looking at the human rights instruments in the 1960s and 1970s, the European Convention on Human Rights, how various countries in Europe have adopted those conventions, and then we start looking at some of the case law. Very rarely do law faculties ask, where did the UN Declaration of Human Rights get its ideas from? So I want to think about that this morning. And to answer the question of where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights got its ideas from, we have to think about two revolutions that happened in the 18th century. One, the French Revolution, with its Declaration of the Rights of Man. The French Revolution was a revolution against an unjust political system in which religion was implicated. The French Revolution declares that there has been a tyranny, oppression by kings who were the super rich of the day, living in obscene luxury while their people starved to death. And that royal tyranny was seen as supported by the Roman Catholic Church in France. And so the people revolted against the abuse of power by their rulers. But a few years before the French Revolution was the American Revolution. And that American Revolution gave us the American Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, amongst these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Can you see the similarity between the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the American Declaration of Independence? It's no accident that Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the United States President, was heavily involved in the drafting of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Well, we've already gone back a couple of hundred years earlier than most law courses, certainly in my country, do. But then the question becomes this: where did the American Declaration of Independence get its idea that all human beings were equal and that human beings had rights? There's a very simple answer to that. It got its ideas from a man called John Locke. John Locke is the philosopher on whose ideas America is built. He's also a key figure in the Enlightenment. He has a theory of epistemology, so how we know things, that philosophy departments still talk about today. He has a political theory that has heavily influenced the shape of democracy in the West. But there are two secrets about John Locke I want to tell you. One, John Locke was a Christian. He wrote a book which he knew would be controversial, so he didn't publish it under his own name. His book was called The Reasonableness of Christianity. There's another secret about John Locke that's recently been revealed by Professor Jeremy Waldron at Oxford University. And that is that Locke is the man who really tells modern philosophy and human rights theory that all human beings are equal. But you can't make Locke's arguments work if you take out the references to the Bible. So here you have an Enlightenment philosopher who gives us the shape of politics and human rights theory as we understand it today, and his best arguments, in fact at points his only arguments, are based on his Christian beliefs. The book that tells you all about this is called God, Locke and Equality. And that's really interesting because not only was Locke worried about equality, Locke was also worried about human rights in general. In particular, he was worried about how you control the power of government. How do you limit the power of government? And in particular, how do you avoid clashes between religious beliefs and the power of government? And Locke was worried about that because he lived in a situation which was similar to ours in some respects. Similar to ours in that it was a situation in which you had people with different religious beliefs and people with no religious beliefs, people with strong religious beliefs, people with weak religious beliefs, living together in the same society. And that had been the situation in Europe for about 150 years in the West, for much longer in other places in Europe, before Locke was writing. And Locke pushed very hard for the idea of a right to freedom of religion and to freedom of conscience. I said that Locke is the man that the United States draws on as its philosopher. You know that because the First Amendment to the United States Constitution introduces freedom of religion. So the thing that he thought was the first human right is the thing that the US Constitution thinks is the first human right. Now people often ask me, well, freedom of religion is okay for people who have beliefs, but what's the point of freedom of religion for people who don't have beliefs? I think there are two answers to that. One answer is, of course, the freedom of religion is also the freedom not to have a religion. The freedom of religion is there for believers and non-believers. It means you don't live in a country where you are told what you have to think about the big questions. The second thing is, pick any country around the world that you like. Maybe go back to your own country's recent history, and you tend to find that countries that don't have freedom of religion don't have many other freedoms either. Freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, somehow or other they all seem to be found in the same place and to the same extent that a country has freedom of religion. So we go back to a situation of religious disagreement in the middle of the 1500s and the 1600s to understand why Locke is worried about human rights. But as I said, for Locke the big problem wasn't terrorism. There was terrorism in his day, but for Locke the big problem was tyranny. Oppressive, arbitrary action by government. We've always been worried about that in England. This year we are celebrating the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, a document agreed between the King and the Lords of the country, which established the right to a fair trial, and the right only to be imprisoned if you have broken the criminal law. Now, our history over the next 800 years is not like that. It's not a perfect ride. For Britain, it's been like that over 800 years. But we have always looked back to this document. And so we have a major exhibition on at the moment showing the influence of that document on the thought of Locke, and then on the, US Declaration of Independence, and then on the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And if you can find a way of getting a visa to my country, which is impossible now as I understand it, then you can go to London and see those wonderful documents all on display. But actually, I think there was something even more significant that happened in my country. That means that we care about human rights and the rule of law. And it happened about 30 or 40 years before Magna Carta. We had a king, Henry II. He is the founder of the English legal system. We date law in our country from 1189. That is year zero for English law. So Henry II is the guy who created the English legal system. He is the reason why the English have the common law system and not a Roman law system. He was also a murderer. He murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury. He murdered a man called Thomas Becket. Thomas and Henry had been friends. Henry appointed Thomas to be Archbishop because he wanted a friend who was going to do what he said in charge of the church. His friend refused to do what the king said, so the king had 4 knights go and kill the Archbishop of Canterbury in his cathedral. This led to public outcry against the king. And the tomb of Thomas Becket became the largest site of pilgrimage in England for 400 years. So for 400 years, people would walk hundreds of miles in order to remember that the king's power was limited, that the king could be a murderer, that the king could break the law. And so that's why my country has worried about the rule of law so much, because it's had this sort of popular memory of this. That actually isn't the first time in history, though, that the church condemned a king who broke the law. The first time that happened was in 390. It was a few hundred miles to the east of here, in Thessaloniki. In Thessaloniki, in 390, the Emperor Theodosius ordered the massacre of everybody in the entire town. He committed genocide. He wiped out 7,000 inhabitants of that town. Now Emperor Theodosius is the man, more than Constantine, who made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. So he went back home to Milan to go to church the next Sunday. And Ambrose, the Archbishop of Milan, shut the doors of the church in the face of the emperor. He refused to let him in. In fact, he refused to let him in until the king had spent several months apologizing publicly for his actions. So there you have, back in 390, people of faith worrying about the rule of law, challenging tyranny on behalf of everybody. But why? Why did the Christian church do that in my country? Why did Ambrose do that in relation to this massacre? One of the most extraordinary claims that human rights make is that all human beings are fundamentally equal. Apparently, according to the American Declaration of Independence, that is self-evident. Is it self-evident that all human beings are fundamentally equal? Some cultures believe men are better than women. Other cultures, perhaps with more justification, believe that women are better than men. Some cultures have believed that white people are better than black people. Some cultures have believed that if you're rich, that's a sign that you are being blessed, and therefore you're worth more than somebody who's poor. So why do we want to react against those kinds of ideas? See, one of the extraordinary parts of the Christian story is that Jesus doesn't do what you'd expect him to do. You would expect him to come as a messenger of God and live in a palace. And he doesn't. He comes and lives as a poor person. You would expect him to take control of the reins of power. Instead, he has to flee as a child, a refugee. I guess you've been watching on your television screens the same things we have been watching in England about the boats coming across the Mediterranean with people drowning, trying to get into fortress Europe. Yeah, refugees are still a problem. All human beings are equal, but those who are members of the European Communion are more equal than others, is the message the immigration policy seems to tell sometimes. He treats women as equals. That's unusual in his culture. He respected people from different cultures. He didn't have a go at the Romans that he met as individuals. And then, well, he dies as a criminal. You wouldn't expect a messenger from God to do any of those things. And what do? All those things say, I think all human beings are equal in God's sight. Doesn't matter if they're refugees. Doesn't matter what colour they are. Doesn't matter what class they are. Doesn't matter what sex they are. Well, of course, I may have done a great job so far of persuading you that I can show how the Christian tradition, particularly in the West, has contributed to the idea of human rights. That can create a problem because some people then say, well, that's very interesting. If human rights are basically a Christian idea, what about how they sit with other faiths? So let's go back further. The American Declaration of Independence again. We hold that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creators with certain unalienable rights. So the way I understand human rights is this. If you have a creator God who made human beings, then every member of the human species has a value, an irreplaceable value, because they have been created. And that's something that Christians and Muslims and Jews can all affirm. So there is common ground between different religions on which they can discuss, establish human rights. What gets more difficult is how you establish human rights if you don't have a creator. If you don't have a creator, how do we get the human species? Just random evolution. If it's random evolution, well, some of us might be more evolved than others. Maybe Lionel Messi is more valuable than the rest of us because of his footballing skills. Maybe people who make it to be professors are more valuable because of their intellect. How do you show that all human beings are equal if they're not created? That's the question I'd like to leave with you. My title was Human Rights, the Cause or the Cure for Terrorism. Human rights were clearly designed as a cure for tyranny. But precisely because they were supposed to be a cure for tyranny, precisely because they were supposed to restrain the abuse of power by rulers, they were supposed to create a free society in which people had less reason to take up arms against their fellow citizens and against their governments. Now that raises some interesting questions I hope we're going to get into a little later about what happens when people use and abuse their human rights to offend others. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, David. That was really interesting. I'd like to give the floor to Professor Dr. Altin Shegani, the Dean of the University. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. In fact, I would like to share with you, just in 15 minutes, some perceptions and reflections on terrorism, but started from a very specific criminal law perspective. I have prepared something under the title of the criminal law of public order as a guardian of public interests. You know that the terrorism is directly connected with the notion of the terrorists. Started from the specific material object. The law is the invisible line of conduct and generally aimed at ensuring peace and development within a human society at a given period. So, law and action are inextricably linked. The law authorizes any action in accordance with practices established and respected by a specific human society. The law, in this sense, is not only an animator, but also a regulator and a moderator of life in society. It ensures compliance with rules based on morals, ethics, and religion. It also requires respect for the collective public order established by power in the supposed interest of the entire population. The criminal law disposition, as part of general criminal law, protects essential interests or values of human society. In other words, or in other terms, it protects juridical goods that are essential to the common good. These goods constitute the juridical object of the offense. If the expression of juridical goods protected by criminal law finds its expression the notion of public order. Criminal law, with the specific object to prevent by threat and, if necessary, to suppress by the pronunciation of a sentence the actions and omissions that may cause a disturbance to public order, criminal law searches according to one of the most classic definitions that can be given: the maintenance of exterior order and peaceful organization of relations between people. Being understood as an object of a subjective right, the public order seems inseparable from its recognition by the law as a juridical good, although sometimes the first reaction of the French jurist is to reject this appellation. In fact, it seems clear that the criminal law aims to prevent public disorder and, if necessary, punish those who have caused it. Therefore, the order relates to the conception of the defense of public interest through the sanction of criminal law in its objective meaning as all the legal rules established by the states in order to connect with the act which constitutes the offense, the penalty contained in the sanctions, or in its jus puniendi, e drejta për të ndëshkuar, subjective sense, known as the right of state to punish. Its role is to ensure respect of the nomenclature of human rights in a society. In our opinion, this is the reason for the promotion of a criminal law model of public order in a contemporary democratic society. The suppression of terrorists is a necessary in addition to the harm caused by the offense. Prevention, meanwhile, can be defined as a well thrown over the Statue of Liberty. If public order is a necessary condition for individual freedom, it is not a sufficient condition, in fact. Its result. It serves to structure of public order. If in other juridical disciplines only some of their components are considered part of public order, criminal law is entirely devoted to the protection of public order. Let's say from a very specific way, from a very specific and technical way. You know, the theft or every offense is connected with the notion of the public order. But technically, very technically, the terrorism is directly connected with the notion of the public order. You know, started from the, let's say, our Albanian criminal law doctrine. By its very purpose, criminal law is a right of public order. Security is essential for the enjoyment of freedom, says Mary Robinson. The safety of human beings reminds us that it is not a question of weapons, it is a question of life and human dignity that pass obligatorily by the economy, food, health, environment, and public security. Criminal law falls within the temporally of the biological life of human beings. Contemporary criminal law is the law of internal security of any state. Public order is considered the sine qua non condition of the enjoyment of individual liberty. In the absence of public order, human relations, including those social, of course, lose their social purpose. Public order is the ability, in fact, to be in perpetual movement, which provides the salvation and the law allows the survival of any criminal justice system. So terrorism is a challenge to be criminalized, to be incriminated, repressed, and prevented. And that's more than an obligation, in fact, not only from a criminal law perspective, but from, first of all, from the moral perspective. In contrast, a non-adapted system generates an extreme reaction in the opposite direction. So, it supports in a non-voluntary way the development of the phenomenon. Without the existence of the public order, the major human interests are at risk. Naturally, in such circumstances, the criminal law seeks to protect the social order as a promoter and protector of human value. As an excellent French speaker, you, Professor McIlroy, you can absolutely, I'm sure, that you know the specific French incrimination, apologie du terrorisme. So I think that could be a very sensible subject of treatment in the future. Maybe why not for the students of my faculty. So the article is a little bit long, and I will stop it here, just in order to leave the possibility of the students, of the participants, to direct questions or maybe to express opinions about this theme, which is very sensible, which is just in time. We're looking about the events, different not only political events in the world and in some very touched regions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor. We're going to continue this with some questions. Some of them I've jotted down during the time here, and some of those questions will come from you. In about 10 minutes or so, we'll send out this card where you can comment, and there's some specific questions. You got them already? Okay, good. But before that, think of things that you might want to ask in relation to what we've been speaking right now, and I will start. I've got 3 questions down, and the first one, and I'd like to pose those questions to both of you, distinguished guests. First one is, human rights, which is the topic that we're talking about, can sometimes, go into a territory where it causes some conflict, as it did in France. So, how would you, Mr. McElroy, answer the question, can I use my human rights, and specifically the human right of freedom of speech, to offend other people or other people's beliefs? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I like very much what your dean was saying about the purpose of the criminal law. It's always very interesting to look at the technical details of the law of theft, but it's helpful to stand back and ask, what is it that criminal law is there to do? And your dean very clearly identified that the criminal law is there to protect the common good, and that it protects the common good by establishing the public order that is necessary for individual freedoms. So the issue we run into with the right to offend is the question, at what point does my exercise of my individual freedom begin to provoke a reaction in others that might become a threat to public order? And it would be nice to be able to say, well, the answer is clearly this, or that the answer is clearly that. But as lawyers know, the reason why you have two hands is so you can say on the one hand this, and on the other hand that. So on the one hand, I want to say that there is a right to offend. If we are serious about pursuing truth, we know that we pursue truth together by dialogue and by disagreement. So sometimes we have to be free, particularly in a university context, but in general discussion, to be able to say, I think your ideas are wrong, I think your ideas are dangerous, and I think your ideas, if followed through to this conclusion, will lead to conclusions that you yourself might not wish to accept. But we should not use our right to freedom of speech to be gratuitously offensive. And for my part, I think that some of the cartoons that the Danish newspaper produced and some of the cartoons that Charlie Hebdo produced were gratuitously offensive. They weren't trying to make a serious point, they were ridiculing. It then becomes a difficult question. Should that be illegal? Should the criminal law prevent those actions? And that's an interesting trade-off. And we might come back to that in some later questions.
Sure, I'd like to ask you as well, Professor. So would that be a matter of criminal law, then somebody offends through language?
Just I have to explain something concerning that we discussed, apologie du terrorisme. Is the very good example of incrimination, if we could consider of the right of the speech, because it's a question to incriminate the moral support given to the terrorists, and how to consider in the case of the right of the speech, every people, every human being has the right to express, let's say, in total liberty, the opinion, or we have to think about the terrorists as a very globalized now threat and risk, major risk, and we have to condemn. Of course, there are incriminations, specific incriminations on the field, and specific sanctions. But is on the right place this kind of apologie du terrorisme? This kind of moral support given to the terrorism or not? it could be let's say, a very interesting moment to discuss and to reflect about it, because it's a very difficult point. You have to find the arguments in the favor, and on the other hand, in the contrary of this. There are some points in criminal law is just the question, for example, of the death penalty. There are arguments pro and yes, and against, of course. Let's think all about it.
So there's this talk going on about terrorism, the fight against terrorism, and then violating the rights of those who are suspected of terrorism in order to defend the rights of those who are being threatened by terrorism. I saw that Mr. McElroy took some notes. I'd like to give you a chance to respond to the professor's speech, please.
I'm really grateful to the professor for what she was saying, and slightly uncomfortable, of course, because of her entirely justified criticism of my government. I'm told that you can tell in Albania which community somebody has as a background by their surname. So you'll be able to tell if somebody's coming from the north or from the south or from the plains. Well, my surname is Mbajtur, and within my country, that surname will tell you that I come from Northern Ireland. And I grew up at a time when we had a terrorist problem in Northern Ireland, which was regarded by the terrorists as a war for independence, and was regarded by the British authorities as criminal activity. And there is absolutely no doubt that the British government responded to that terrorism by illegal acts. They derogated from human rights, they introduced exceptions to human rights, they had police officers who were collaborating with terrorists who were fighting against the terrorists. They arranged extrajudicial executions, people were locked up without charge. There are all sorts of things that were done that were violations of human rights, which were done in the name of state security. And there is absolutely no doubt that just as Professor Cohen, who was being referred to, identified, those actions deepened the problem. Those actions convinced a lot of people that the terrorists who were fighting for independence were fighting a war and were not simply a threat to public order. And in the end, we had to reach an agreement with the political parties that were the apologists for the terrorism in order to resolve the problem. And we haven't really learned our lesson from that. Our own history in the 1970s and 80s should tell us that violating human rights in order to fight terrorism is not going to succeed. Instead of which we have, as being pointed out, this Extradition Act, which enables us simply to shift the problem to America, where they can park it in Guantanamo Bay, which is, on any view, illegal under international law. You're either a criminal or you're at war under international law. You can't be something else, which is what the people in Guantanamo Bay are said to be. The Professor's main point, I think, was about torture. And torture is where we sort of pull the two themes together. The theme of human rights as a response to tyranny by the state, and the interaction between human rights and terrorism by individuals and groups challenging the state. Because torture seems to me to be a form of state terrorism. That's what's happening. With torture, you have a state that is violating the law, violating human rights. And it is a terrorist activity. It is designed to terrify people.
But this time, very shortly, we've got about 5 minutes left. But I'd like to ask any of you if you have any questions for any of the professors here. you might ask it right now. In the opposite case, I'd like to present you with something that's happening next week, next Wednesday, at 6 o'clock at Blue Life Institute. We're going to have a post-forum, or as we call it in Albanian, pas-forum. It's going to take place on the 6th of May at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It's right behind the public radio and television building, where we can ask more questions and have a deeper conversation about these topics, about the law, and about the philosophy of human rights and how they apply to us today. That said, does anybody have a question they want to ask right now? Yes. All right, we got two. All right, go ahead, please. Can you please stand up and shout?
Yeah, so as I understand the question is by reference to a speech made by the person who is currently our Prime Minister in Britain. He may or may not be our Prime Minister after our elections on the 7th of May. So he doesn't have long left at the moment. But if he is our Prime Minister after the 7th of May, he's proposing that the government should monitor all social networks and social media and internet traffic. And the question is, do I think that will be effective to reduce terrorism? No. The reason it won't be is there simply aren't the resources in government to look at what everybody is saying on the internet all the time. It necessarily has to be focused, and as soon as you start focusing, you get to the point where you can't watch what everybody is doing all the time. So you might catch most of the people most of the time, but as somebody said, the authorities have to win every time to prevent all acts of terrorism. The terrorists only have to win once to commit an outrage. Without faith, do I think there can be human rights? No. Let me explain what I mean by that. The slightly longer answer is you have to have faith in something in order to get a theory of human rights off the ground. So you've really got two options, as I see it. And your options are, you have a belief in God, and because you have a belief in God, then you have reasons for believing in human rights or thinking that there are human rights. If you don't believe in God, you end up having to have faith in human rights themselves. Because I have yet to see a convincing argument from somebody who doesn't believe in God as to why there are definitely human rights. Because in the end, they become, the best arguments are, well, we have human rights because we have capabilities. Human beings are capable of certain things. Because human beings are capable of certain things, then they should have rights. That's a good argument. You say, what about those human beings who aren't capable of those things because of illness or disability? Do those people not have rights? So maybe we just lower the bar a bit. So we reduce the bar so we make sure that everybody has those kinds of rights, capabilities included. And then you get a court case that's going on in the States at the moment. There's a court case in the United States of America on behalf of 4 chimpanzees. And the case is being brought by the Non-Human Rights Association. And they have applied for something called the writ of habeas corpus, which is a declaration that these chimpanzees are being falsely imprisoned. And that has been given permission by a judge to go forward to a hearing.
so I want to take this last chance to thank Mr. David McElroy, Mr. Atin Sheghani, and also Elisa Nipefendi. Thank you very much, professors, for all your wise remarks today. I want to invite all of you, don't forget, next Wednesday, 5 o'clock, it's next to the radio and television building, but also right now we have a little cocktail and social time so you can meet and greet with the guests. Thanks a lot.